Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for today's webinar on React, Rethink, Recover Destination Management Solutions to the COVID-19 crisis. So before we begin, just want to let everyone to know that we will have a Q&A at the end of all the presentations. Please use the chat function. You'll see it on the bottom of your screen to please send in your questions. You won't be able to use your microphone or your video, so any questions you would like to ask any of our speakers, please do type them in. Regarding the recording of the webinar, please do, that will be made available upon request. So if you would like to request a copy of the video or the presentation slides, please do email me directly. My email will be provided for you at the end of the webinar. And so with that, I'd like to pass over now to Dr. Mario Harder to give just a little introduction to today's webinar. Mario?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't know if you can actually see me, but I'm Mario Hardy. I'm the CEO of the Pacific Asia Travel Association, PATA, and I'd like to thank each one of you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We are going through a situation that we've probably all have experienced for the first time in our life. Many of us have actually experienced crises and challenges in the past, but I think you all agree with me, never we experienced something like this one. The numbers are unprecedented. We have estimate over $100 billion of loss for the travel and tourism industry this year alone. WTTC has estimated as of yesterday, revised numbers of expected 75 million job losses in the industry over the coming month and year. So it is indeed a very steep problem, a very deep crisis for us, for an industry. And therefore, we thought actually putting this webinar together with a group of experts would be really useful for all of us to get a better perspective on how is the situation at the moment, what are we forecasting moving forward, but most importantly, also understand better what can you do, what can we do in this time of crisis to prepare ourselves for recovery when it comes. I'd like to actually personally thank Sarah Matthews from TripAdvisor, who is also one of PATA's board member, who had the initial thought and initiative of putting this team together, this group of individuals who are expert in their field and joining us today. And on that note, I will actually pass the microphone to Mr. Tom Rogers, who's the head of microeconomics consulting for Asia, the tourism economics, Oxford Economics company, and to share his perspective. So thank you, Paul. I'll pass it over to Tom.
Thank you very much indeed, Mario. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to share my screen now, and then I'll be able to talk through Oxford Economics and Tourism Economics' latest view on where we're going in terms of the global economy, and also what the implications are for the APAC tourism market. Before I do, just allow me to take a moment to briefly introduce Oxford Economics. For those of you who aren't familiar, Oxford Economics is one of the world's leading economics and business consulting firms. We were founded in 1981 when a group of postgraduate students at the University of Oxford Economics Department collaborated to build a model of the world economy. And over the 30 years since, that's become the world's most widely used, commercially available model of the world economy, used amongst central banks, ministries of finance, the financial sector, and many more beyond. The global economic model underpins all of our forecasting, and it's essentially supported the kind of build out of a number of more specialized economic forecasting services, one of which is our specialized subsidiary Tourism Economics, which provides operators across the sector with the insight that they need to help plan for the future. So please do get in touch with me directly at trogers at Oxford Economics if you have any more questions about Oxford Economics and Tourism Economics, and I also have a slide at the end with some contact details as well. So let's just recap where we think we stand as far as COVID-19. Oxford Economics is a leading economics analytical firm, but obviously we're as uncertain as everyone else as far as this particular shock to the world and to the world's health goes. And so we're following the numbers just as closely as everyone else. So at the moment, I think the latest case numbers is over 460,000 as of a few minutes ago. And it's gone from very much being a focused problem within China to being an Asian pandemic around a month or so ago, but now quite clearly a global pandemic. We're seeing travel restrictions imposed by over 150 countries, and equally as important from a kind of economic perspective, we're seeing lockdowns in well over 100 countries, either partially in 40 countries or fully in, would make it around 60 countries so far. So as an economics consultancy, how do we think about the impact that this kind of shock has on the global economy and therefore into household spending power? Well, we've been monitoring the evolution of the outbreak over the past few months, and essentially we've tracked three key supply or three key transmission mechanisms so far. Probably the first to be impacted was supply chains. So when factories in China shut down, obviously that had a major impact on the factories elsewhere, particularly in Asia, that were supplying into China, but also the factories and the manufacturing supply chains elsewhere around the world that relied upon China for their inputs, so either their intermediate goods or for the capital goods that they were using to boost their manufacturing capacity. So that was really the first channel of impact that we saw. We then started to see confidence impacts as markets started to worry particularly about the possibility that this was going to become a truly global pandemic. So we saw steep corrections in equity markets around the world. Consumers were starting to factor that into their spending plans, seeing the wealth impacts through their retirement accounts, for example, or through their holdings of equities and so on. So there was a real kind of confidence impact on households' willingness to spend on non-essential goods. And then probably the most powerful impact is what we've seen over the past month or so. So we've gone from a situation where China and some other economies in Asia are restricting movement to a true global lockdown and prohibitions on entering or exiting countries. So, a real kind of barrier to movement, not only between countries, but increasingly within countries as well. And so even consumers who were more wary about spending, well, actually now they're just simply not able to get out there and spend full stop. So we've been tracking the evolution of the COVID outbreak across these types of economic transmission mechanisms over the past few months. Now, these are all serious enough, and as we'll see in the next couple of slides, we think these channels are going to be enough to push the world economy into quite a steep recession in this quarter and moving into next. But the key for governments and policymakers around the world, as far as economic policy is concerned, is really to make sure that we don't see financial conditions acting as an accelerator to the shock or amplifying the impact of the near-term downturn, the near-term restriction. So what do we mean by that? Well, essentially, as businesses are forced to close, they will face severe cash flow problems. So central banks around the world are trying to channel emergency funding into banking sectors, encourage banks to lend that into firms which are fundamentally sound but have cash flow issues. Governments are doing likewise. They're offering wage subsidy schemes to make it possible for workers to remain in post at the same time as they can't actually go into work. And so it's measures like these that are aiming to make it possible for the world economy and for the different economies around the world, essentially, to see a bit of a bounce back and a rapid recovery when the coronavirus outbreak is contained. Without these types of measures, the really aggressive monetary and fiscal stimulus, what we could see essentially is wide-scale bankruptcies amongst businesses and households, and that would mean that a temporary recession in the global economy becomes something far more serious further out. So it's those financial conditions acting as an accelerator, and governments and central banks' ability to stop that from happening that we think is really crucial over the next couple of months. So what do we think is going to be the impact in the near term? Well, one of the ways in which we've been tracking the impact of the outbreak in real time is by looking at the coverage of school closures around the world. So this is a good proxy for not only households being able to get out and go to work, because obviously the more kids are at home from school, the more adults have to stay home from work and look after them, so that inhibits households' ability to earn income. But probably more pertinently, this is becoming a metric for the scale of people who are locked down around the world and the degree to which people simply won't be going out and undertaking the kind of spending that they typically do during their leisure time. So governments around the world are being very clear that households can go out on a limited period to go and get the groceries they want, but they certainly won't be going out and undertaking all the discretionary spending that they normally would. So spending in restaurants, hotels, travel, most pertinently for our audience today, but all the other kind of discretionary spending. So this chart of school closures is a good metric for really kind of gauging that in real time. And when we think about the impacts from people being unable to work and unable to spend in the way that they normally are, this leads us into a kind of benchmark for what we think the economic impact will be on the world economy in the first quarter of this year. And we've shown that in the chart on the right-hand side here. So our baseline economic forecast as of this week is that we expect the world economy to have shrunk, getting on to about 5% in the first quarter of this year. That's pretty much the sharpest quarterly contraction in world output in recorded history. And that is in large part as a result of the restrictions that China's had to implement through the course of the last few months. So a lockdown of around 130 million people, rather, in the Wuhan province, but also the supply chain impacts and the demand side impacts that we've talked about a moment or two ago. So it's a pretty serious situation for Q1, certainly. Then, as I suspect everyone is grappling with, we are having to take judgments about what we think the most likely or the kind of baseline path for the outbreak will be going forward. And so our baseline assumption as far as the outbreak is concerned is that we will see the outbreak start to stabilize through the course of 2020 Q2. So obviously the impact will be different in different economies, but we're already seeing measures like lockdowns in force across most of the world economy. And we hope, as I'm sure everybody does, and as governments do, that will be enough to start containing the spread of the virus and prohibit or prevent the need for yet further barriers to movement of goods and services. So based on that assumption, we're forecasting that the world economy essentially bottoms out in 2020 Q2. And then building further on that assumption, we assume that these measures, the lockdowns, are starting to unwind from 2020 Q3 onwards. And we're quite encouraged in that respect by the fact that the Chinese government seems to be relaxing some of the restrictions that it put in place in Wuhan and Hubei in the first quarter of this year. So based on that assumption, again, we think there'll be a lot of pent-up demand, a lot of catch-up work that will go on across factories and across workplaces across the world, which can drive a V-shaped recovery in the second half of this year and into 2021. So very much a serious outlook for the world economy this quarter, very stagnant economy in the second quarter of this year, and then potentially the scope for a rebound towards the latter end of 2020. But very much conditional on some very uncertain assumptions, as I say. We talked a bit about policy responses. We'll just take a look at what's been going on around the world here. Well, obviously the Federal Reserve has cut its interest rates by around 200 basis points over the last year, and around 150 of that has come since the start of 2020. And that's enabled central banks around the rest of the world, and this is particularly key in Asia. Asian economies tend to be very sensitive to movements in the Federal Reserve rate. This enables central banks around the world to do likewise, and pump cheap money into the banking sectors. And again, that's going to be very important in helping governments to support banks and support businesses in this period of uncertain cash flow. Having said that, there is quite clearly going to be an impact on household finances. So we are seeing the start of a reaction in the labour market, with firms starting to cut back on particularly temporary contracts and temporary employment, not renewing contracts. But also in the UK, for example, we're seeing a lot of retailers close their doors potentially for good, not just for the duration of the outbreak, but there's clearly the risk that at least 1 or 2 quarters of negative growth in the global economy forces the weaker operators and more vulnerable sectors to shut up shop for good. And so households will be faced with a labour market impact that's quite significant, even if governments try their best to keep businesses open and support wages and support jobs over the next 6 months or so. Households are also going to see quite significant wealth effects. So on the chart on the right-hand side here, we've benchmarked the current market correction, current stock market correction, against some previous episodes of stock market corrections. Essentially, what you see here is the blue dots show stock market corrections, sell-offs in periods where there hasn't been a recession, and the red dots show the scale of price declines when there has been a recession. And evidently, as you can see, when the world economy goes into recession, stock market falls tend to be much steeper. So there's potential for yet further wealth effects to hit households in the size of their savings or in the size of their retirement funds, for example. So households will certainly feel both a labour market and a wealth impact from what's going on, probably for quite some time to come. So that's quite a bearish backdrop for what's going on around the global economy. In terms of how we think about what this means for tourism and the tourism market, well, we follow a lot of the daily and the monthly data as much as you guys do, and I'm sure you're keeping track on the levels of bookings that were received by your members, or by the rate of inquiries onto your website, and you're seeing those impacts on a daily basis. We're looking at the length of duration of restrictions and the impact that those restrictions will have dependent on when people tend to travel throughout the year. And at the moment, as you can see, we're in a period of the year when around 7 or 8% of international tourist travel tends to happen per month. And so each month that goes by with a shutdown enforced, we're losing around that amount out of the global market. The impact of what's going on will become more severe if those restrictions extend into the third quarter of the year. So as you can see, around 10 to 11% of global travel tends to happen each month through the third quarter of the year. So the impact of the global recession on the global travel market will depend to a large extent on how long the restrictions to movement last. One of the ways in which we're trying to reflect this uncertainty is essentially to talk about scenarios and to talk about ranges of outcomes rather than attach too much certainty to a particular estimate or a particular forecast. So our baseline working assumption, as I say, is that at the global level, the pandemic starts to stabilize through the second quarter of this year, and that restrictions are starting to ease through the second half of this year. So in particular, that means that we're in the grey area in this matrix here. We've got the restrictions in place from February, March, April, May, and then those restrictions start to ease gradually over the following 4 months. In our modelling, that suggests around a 39% or 40% impact on global international travel this year versus last year, so a quite substantial loss. But as you can see, if you play around with the assumptions and prepare for more severe shutdown scenarios, then you can get to losses in the global travel market for this year that are much more severe and much more significant than that. And this is obviously an assessment that we will be keeping updated on a very frequent basis over the months ahead. In terms of what we think for the global travel market, well, as I've just mentioned, we think that the level of global international tourist arrivals is going to be down around 40% this year, and moving very quickly. So around a month ago, we published our previous forecast. That was at a time before we saw the pandemic go truly global, and the types of lockdown measures that we're seeing now. And as you can see, our range of forecasts at that point was somewhere between -10 and -20 for this year. And so, quite clearly a substantial deterioration in the outlook for the sector over the past month. Now, again, if we were doing this discussion around a month ago, we would probably have expected the impacts to be most severely felt in the APAC region. But because this is quite clearly now not only a global pandemic, but also a global recession with impacts on households' finances globally, actually our modelling suggests that the impact is going to be felt pretty evenly around the globe. Some continents hit less than others, but all within the same kind of broad spectrum of -30 to -40%. And again, that's pretty similar to within the APAC region itself. As we might expect, the Northeast Asia, so particularly China, Hong Kong, Japan and Korea, are likely to be more impacted from both a financial perspective, but also from travellers' willingness to travel into those regions. The Northeast Asia region probably more impacted than others, but nevertheless, because of the global nature of the pandemic and the global nature of financial impacts, all destinations we think will be quite severely impacted. Just a final chart on the bad news before we try and focus a bit more on the positives and preparing for an upturn. It's useful to think about which countries are likely to be most impacted across the APAC region. And I think it's fair to say that our modelling suggests that the countries that are most reliant on Chinese visitors will be the most exposed to falls in tourist inbound arrivals this year. So obviously China's key in that respect, or rather inbound visitors to China will be impacted by restrictions, but countries like Thailand, which have been at the forefront of gaining market share amongst Chinese visitors over the past decade, are going to be most impacted. So Thailand, we think, losing around 15 million visitors in 2020. So that's quite clearly a very bleak picture for this year, and I think we can all understand the reasons why. One of the positive notes that perhaps we might turn to is that because tourism demand tends to be one of the things that consumers cut back on most and most quickly when they're uncertain about their financial situations, it tends to be one of the sectors that's hardest hit by a shock, but it also tends to be one of the things that responds most quickly to household finances improving. And we've seen this most pertinently in the global financial crisis in 2008-9, when global tourist arrivals fell by around 4%, but they rebounded very quickly in 2010 when the global economy stabilized and started to grow again. And that's also true at the Asia-Pac level. Tourism arrivals at 13% in 2010, and also the response to the SARS epidemic is quite useful as a guide to the outlook for next year in this context as well. So a big fall in inbound arrivals to this region in 2003, but it rebounded sharply the following year. So reasons to be optimistic that if the pandemic is contained and if the worst impacts on household finances are protected, then perhaps we can start to see a strong rebound next year. That's the case as far as arrivals is concerned and also spending. But even accounting for the likelihood that there will be a V-shaped recovery next year, it's probably worth being realistic about the scale of that recovery. There will be lingering impacts on people's willingness to travel. There will be lingering impacts, particularly also on their financial situation as well. And so, although we expect the world economy to rebound to growth of around 4% next year, that isn't necessarily going to recoup the financial losses that households have seen in their holdings of equities and their retirement accounts and so on. Nor will it necessarily make up all of the employment impacts that they've suffered through this year. And so we expect somewhere around half of the losses from 2020 to be caught up in 2021. So 2021 essentially will more likely be the start of a recovery rather than a complete recovery from 2020. This matrix is just setting out some more detail in the kind of range of uncertainties that we're looking at, and my colleagues and I are happy to discuss more about our assumptions and the impacts of different markets. But in the interest of keeping things moving along, just let me share a couple of final observations on what we're thinking for travel markets in 2020, 2021. Well, one of the key things that we would point out is that markets that rely largely on domestic travellers will probably have a better recovery or a faster recovery than markets which rely most heavily on cross-border travellers. So we're looking at India, Japan, China in particular in that respect. It's likely that internal barriers to movement will be far more swift to be removed than international barriers, and also travellers are more likely to be willing to travel internally will be to risk an international trip in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. And that's backed up again by some of the evidence that we see from the global financial crisis, possibly for different reasons. Possibly the financial implications make it easier to travel internally rather than internationally, but nevertheless, again, history provides a precedent for supposing that domestic travel will be the first to rebound and see the strongest recovery over the next couple of years. So before I pass over to Damien, let me just say here at Tourism Economics, we are providing quite a lot of up-to-date data for our clients to track the impacts of COVID and its implications going forward. Our global travel service covers 185 countries around the world, and our global city travel service does the same for around 300 cities. Please do get in touch with myself or my colleague Becky Hindley if you'd like to hear more about how we work with our clients on tourism flows. Okay, Mario, I'll hand back to you, and perhaps I'm happy to take questions now, or I'm also happy to save questions for the discussion.
Well, thank you, Tom. I'll take it from here, but we'll take the questions at the end. So we'll thank you very much, Tom. And now I'll pass it over to Damien Cook, the CEO of eTourism Frontiers, and Greg Clausen, the partner at 2031. So, Damien, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good to be with everybody again, and welcome to everybody who's joined us across Asia as unprecedented time for tourism. And thanks, Tom, for a great presentation there. Which really laid out the scenario that we're all finding ourselves in. Most of us have been thrown a curveball by what's happened. We've been flooded coming from multiple sources. And many of us now are moving to a phase where we're looking for solutions. And what Greg and I would like to talk about today is a solutions-based approach to recovery. How we're going to move forward from this position. And we're identified 3 key phases that we're all going to find ourselves moving through. This phase we're in now, which is a reactionary phase. We're reacting to what's happening across the world. How we shift that into a rethinking stage where we start to make our plans for how we're going to take this forward. And then how that's going to eventually shift us through to recovery. So Greg will be joining me on the call. Greg and I work together as strategic consultants with multiple destinations around the world. Greg is in Canada at the moment. I'm in Kenya, where I'm based right now. We've been talking to lots of DMOs across the planet in the past couple of weeks, getting a handle on the situation and starting to identify those ways forward. So let's get into it. The agenda today, we're going to start just looking at this crisis in terms of what it is, which is an existential threat to tourism. We're going to have a quick look at a situation analysis. Tom's really laid the picture in terms of data there. And we're going to move into how we deal with moving through those 3 phases, how we react to this, how our reaction leads us into a stage of rethinking our approach to tourism, which is something that's absolutely essential. And then how that's going to drive us towards recovery, when and how that's going to appear and how we can manage that and what the way forward and next steps will be. This is a basic rule in crisis management that's always been there. Everything you do before a crisis is going to be seen as an overreaction, but as we're seeing now, when the crisis actually hits, everything during and after that crisis is often seen as inadequate. Most of us were not prepared for this. Nobody could have been prepared for what has happened, and we're really having to find solutions on the fly. And it really is, you've heard Mario use, you've heard Tom use, and it's true that we have within the space of a couple of months seen something move from a position of being an Asian problem or a Chinese market problem, which has impacted everyone from the poorest people in the world in Burkina Faso to the Prince of Wales, who's now infected with the virus. So it is unprecedented. It's a crisis like nothing we've seen before. We shifted from what we saw as possibly a potential that may affect Chinese outbound travel into a global shutdown of the entire industry. The shell shock that we saw with the cancellation of ITB is now seems like a minor thing compared to every tourism event, every tourism business, and every tourism channel being shut down within the space of essentially a month. So our sector is effectively shut down. WTTC is projecting, as Paul said, over 75 billion jobs lost. Those financial losses are exceeding anywhere over $100 billion. And most critically, as Tom's just shown, people's consumer spending ability and their travel confidence is being eroded to an all-time low. And the real reality we have to face is that all of the models that science is showing us how the virus would be stopped involve stopping travel, staying home and not moving. The very basics of what tourism is has had to become stopped, and that has created an existential threat to our industry. And we've all seen these images around the world. One tourism site after another becomes devoid of traffic, devoid of tourism, and in fact our cities and our everyday lives. We never could have projected that we would see a crisis like this in tourism. And so we need to react to this in a new way. The most important thing is accepting the reality. This is not a minor crisis. This is an existential crisis to our entire industry. It's not going to end quickly. We're realizing now there isn't going to be one day where suddenly we say Corona's disappearing and we can quickly go back to where we were. It's probably not going to have a defined ending. People are talking about second waves of the virus. People are talking about phases of infection. It would be very hard for us to define a definite ending or even a definite turnaround point. We're going to talk about how you address that at a strategic level. But most importantly, travel itself is going to fundamentally change. The sector is not going to resume as it was before. This will have long-lasting impacts on tourism. And equally, we now need to accept that we will not reach a point where we can just resume functioning the way we did as a DMO. Those tourism plans that we wrote last year in 2019 no longer exist, can no longer be implemented in a single day when all of this changes and we can resume business as usual. Essentially, what we need to consider, every one of us as a DMO and as a business, is that we have just become a startup. Effectively, we're at ground zero when it comes to tourism. We're starting at a level playing field, but every single destination marketing and management organization in the world is now a startup business. You're having to rebuild your entire industry, starting from square one. We need to see that our airlines and our air access has gone in most destinations. Our tour operators and channels of tourism have gone. And those organizations, as we move into a recovery phase, and our visitors are going to prioritize destinations who have had a plan in place before recovery, as opposed to those destinations that are trying to create a strategic plan once recovery begins. Those airlines are financially strapped. They've been hard hit. They're going to choose the destinations they start flying back to carefully, and they're going to look for destinations that can prove that they can deliver them carrying capacity, that they're putting in the effort now to have marketing plans ready and recovery plans ready to actually get passengers into those planes, where there's a likelihood they will phase their returns and your destination may not be a priority for them. So we need to make ourselves a priority for those channels to come back. We need to avoid self-destructive behavior at this time, and we're seeing it in some of our conversations with DMOs. We can't just wait and see what happens. With each day, more and more damage is being done, less and less likelihood of us being in a position to be able to recover. We need to start making plans now. We can't just say this is a global problem. It's not our problem. We'll let the world sort it out. This has created a local problem for every destination in the world. We can't just say, let's keep marketing. Let's try and sell our destination. Let's advertise. Advertising will not solve this problem. We need to look at how we positively engage with the market and when they're going to be traveling and what content and what channels we'll be able to reach them now to ensure that we don't lose visibility with those markets and that we're in a position for them to come back to us once they're able to do so. We want to make sure that we don't make uninformed responses or decisions that aren't based on data or hard facts that we've got access to. And also we need to realize that just as we can't go back to business as usual, we can't keep functioning in the same way. If you're going to fall back on your old procurement and processes and procedure processes to get in the emergency resources and help that you need now, that is going to slow things down even more than ever at a time when governments are struggling to function, and that can present a real threat to your hope for recovery. So let's look at the three phases that we need to move through, and we'll start with the reaction to this. The biggest question that we're hearing, as Tom mentioned, and we're hearing from everybody, is when is this going to end? It's a natural human reaction. We all want to know when things are going to start getting better. And as Tom has shown, we can make data projections about this. We can start to get some idea of when this is going to turn around, but it may not be a strictly defined point. An important thing to understand as we start to develop strategic plans is something called phase shift. There will be phases of recovery. We can't be sure of when they will be or when we'll move from one to the next, but we need to be prepared for that. And that means having a strategy that's phase shift built, meaning that when you see an indicator of change happening, when we start to see those indicators of recovery, and we'll list them later, resumption of travel, ease of restrictions, those things, that you are ready with actions to put into play as soon as you start to see those indicators, but also to potentially pause them if things start to change negatively during that time as well. So we're starting to see estimates, as Tom showed us there, of what we're looking at. So here in terms of negative impact and spread of the virus, peak period, a plateau period, and then the potential for recovery as that plateaus to drop down. The term flattening the curve that everyone is talking about. So if we look at that across the year based on current estimates, we can start to place where each of these phases are. A phase of reaction that we're in at the moment, moving into a rethinking period where we now need to start building the strategies towards recovery to lead us into that recovery phase. So while we can map those generally in terms of where they are and how we're going to move from one to the next, we need to consider each of those points of phase shift. When do we move from reaction to re-strategization? When is that strategization going to be put into effect to move us towards recovery? And having a phase shift built plan with clear indicators and time plans for achieving that. So let's start with phase one, that reaction phase. The most important resource at our fingertips right now is information. It's what everybody is looking for, clear and accurate information for the situation on the ground and where we're headed. This trust barometer done by Edelman just last week shows us that everyone's now turning online looking for information. Most people around the world are checking those apps from Johns Hopkins or the WHO several times a day to monitor the numbers, to see the progress. And everyone's looking for accurate information. And information is one of your most important resources at this time as a destination marketing organization. You need to be a source of credible information to your trade, to those prospective travelers or future travelers that are going to be there during recovery, and to other government agencies that are. That credible information is your main asset. When you share information as an organization, as a destination marketing organization, in fact, you can bet everything that you're going to publish. We need to eliminate what's called the FOAF factor. FOAF is a friend of a friend. And we've all seen this in our social media channels. I have a friend who's a nurse and she told me this. I have a friend who's in the army and they told me this. I know somebody who works for this organization who said that. We cannot rely on anecdotal social media shared information that's not sourced, vetted, and accurate. We need to identify those accurate sources. In your messaging to your trade, make sure that you have channels to be able to communicate to your trade. That shouldn't be your visit wherever Facebook feed that has an audience of tourists and potential consumers. They do not want to see your corporate and internal communications to your trade put out there. It will just remind them of the problems you're facing as a destination. So find ways to get that information out to those partners that you work with, and practice ephemeral messaging. What does that mean? Things are changing so quickly that you need to look at your past messaging. Things you say today may not be correct tomorrow, or maybe not correct next week. You may forget what you've posted or what you've released to the information. Release content, and then when it becomes inaccurate or unreliable, delete it. Remove that messaging from your communication process. Talk about the here and now, and constantly update any information that you're publishing. Seek allies in the trade and media that you can use to be able to source that information as well. Because ultimately, that credibility that you'll create from releasing that material is your trust with those partners, and your trust with potential travelers as well. Studies have shown in the last week how important that trust is for you to be seen as a credible organization. So make sure you've got resources in play to be able to gain that trust and inspire confidence from those partners. You need to have a communication plan in place. That has to have a structure, and it has to identify who can say what via which channels to which audiences. Make sure you create those official channels of communication, and don't use your consumer-driven channels for dissemination of corporate information. Create an online resource hub you can send particularly your industry to for trusted information. Reinvent the wheel and create those resources. There are lots of them out there that are being shared, and Pata is at the moment building a resource hub for crisis information, linking together all of those people who are providing credible information. And keep in touch with your industry. Use survey tools or have a strategy that regularly surveys your industry, asking them how you're suffering the most at the moment, what are the challenges you're facing, so you can start to respond to those, and what opportunities are they seeing to keep their businesses afloat and start to move towards recovery, so that you've constantly got a pulse reading from your trade. Make sure that you don't turn your shareholders, your stakeholders in the industry, into enemies. A lot of people are going to go out of business. We've seen that, the impacts that it's going to have. People will be angry. People will blame government for this. There is going to be an inevitable negative backlash back towards you as an organization, but try and minimize that impact by showing as much support and keeping your stakeholders at the forefront of your strategy as much as possible. Don't create false hope. Don't make them feel better by suggesting this will end soon or it's almost over. You need to be realistic. You need to confirm, and you need to make sure you never confirm or deny any reports or information without verification, and make sure you make sure you don't get into a confrontational situation with the media or those negatively impacted stakeholders, particularly in any public conversations. And don't take any reactive action that's going to permanently impact your business or destination into the future. What's important are those partnerships with your business community. Public-private sector partnerships are more important than ever. This trust barometer from last week shows that people trust government and businesses working together than either of those in isolation. So working towards those PPPs, those public-private sector partnerships, is critical and essential. Try and support your government infrastructure as much as possible. We're seeing around the world a trend of tourism starting to play a role in relief of this situation. In many destinations, hotels are now being used as quarantine centers or even for isolation and treatment of non-serious cases to take pressure off hospitals. We're starting to see tourism vehicles used to send out test kits and resources out as well. Hospitality workers have a potential role in this too when it comes to hygiene, cleaning of sites and locations. The more support you can show to your government at the time, the more they will value and the more they will support tourism as you move forward. So in terms of the react phase, a to-do list for what you need to do now as a destination, start planning now. Start developing a strategy now. Do not wait and see what happens when this situation happens. Aggregate and share information. Make sure you communicate in a credible manner to your trade, to future travelers and governments, and build those public-private sector partnerships and build up a sense of community with your business sector and government. And that's what will start to move you forward. So now at a strategic level, we need to start rethinking the way that we are going to work towards recovery. We cannot go back to 2019 strategy. As we said, you're a startup organization, and that means starting afresh with a new strategy. That means being prepared for recovery, carrying out risk and threat assessments. And Greg's going to talk shortly about what those are in terms of channels, in terms of segments in the markets that you're reaching out to. Make sure you've got baselines in terms of your pre-COVID markets. Where were you at the start of this year? Who are you going to lose? Who can you afford to lose? Who can you not afford to lose? And where will potential recovery lie? You need to prioritize positive content aggregation, getting positive content out there about the destination now, not to sell travel to them, but to keep them aware that your destination exists and get them thinking about where they're going to travel to when they're able to travel again. And make sure your team is ready for that phased process of implementing the strategy when we see indicators of recovery. In terms of your organization as a DMO, streamline your team. Make sure that the core people with core functions that are critical for recovery are in their jobs. We may see reduced budgets, we may see downsizing. Think about who your core staffing are. Have a plan for what happens if some of those core staffing becomes sick or unable to work as well, to ensure that you can actually deliver recovery. Stop selling. This is not a time for advertising. This is not a time for conversion and trying to sell travel, of course. Think about how you're going to redistribute those marketing budgets, those advertising budgets you had. Start to put them into strategy, into planning, into positive content, and creating a financial war chest for moving forward towards recovery. What sort of content should you be publishing now as a destination? It has to be about retaining engagement with those potential travelers. Don't do business and don't sell, but equally don't be invisible to those travelers who will be coming back to travel next year. They need to remember that you exist. They need to put you onto that travel later or travel tomorrow list, as the UNWTO is encouraging. You have an audience now of people who are at home, they're depressed, they're demoralized, but they're dreaming about what will happen when this ends. This Kantar study done 2 weeks ago asked people what they want to do after the pandemic. Only 60% want to go to a restaurant, half of them want to go shopping, 45% of them are already thinking about travel. So people are finding ways to get travel content out there in front of them. So we're starting to see a lot of virtual content being published. Everybody is online now. So we're seeing experiential content being shared in a virtual space, virtual tours of museums, of tourist attractions around the world, the aquarium with the penguins release that everybody saw, zoos that are starting to put cameras on their enclosures so people can see those animals. Not ads, not just promotion for destinations, but actual virtual experiences they can have. And the reason you want to do that is because they're going to remember these places that they want to come back and visit again. In Kenya, where I'm based, we're looking at live streaming safaris in the next coming weeks, actually getting game drive vehicles out there in our national parks that are now effectively empty with live stream web cameras that people can join for a game drive. Think about what you have in terms of your product and your destination that you can start to virtually share with those audiences. That virtuality will enable you to stay on travelers' minds, a literal captive audience of people who are dreaming of travel. Give them that experiential content. Live stream it and find travel-specific channels. So channels that publish travel content, TripAdvisor, Nat Geo, all of those channels that have focused travel channels, not necessarily just social media channels. One of the problems we're seeing, as I'm sure you've all seen, is that Facebook has become a channel of negativity, of essentially, you're all going to die. Instagram has become a channel of here's some funny memes about how we're all going to die. There's a very negative element out there to social that we need to find alternatives to get that positive content out there as well, and let them stay in touch by retaining a relationship with them. As we share that content, encourage them to register for more information, sign up for competitions with prizes given next year, find a way to actually keep them engaged with the destination. So see it now on your screen, experience it soon, and as the UNWTO said, travel tomorrow. So then you need to look at threat and risk assessments. So here I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Greg, who's going to start talking about how you move through this process of re-strategization heading towards recovery. So over to you, Greg.
Great. Thanks very much, Damien. And good morning, everybody here from Vancouver in Canada. Damien, I'm going to need you to, I think, advance the slides. I don't think I have control from my end, but thanks for that. Yeah, so as Damien mentioned quite clearly a couple of times, you know, if you're looking to recover your market in 2021 by dusting off your playbook from 2019, you're looking at the wrong playbook. We think that, again, has been mentioned earlier, and some pretty bleak messaging that's come out today from both Damien as well as Tom, just how unprecedented this challenge is and the impact that this challenge will have on your destinations going forward. And again, there are some silver linings, there are some opportunities, and I just want to make sure that that our destinations are aware of where some of those risks and where some of those threats lie, so that we can, advance our destinations in a more reasonable way. Part and parcel of that, and Damien did mention this, that we've been advising destinations since this crisis, pretty much since towards the end of January, when this started to become more acute outside of mainland China, in talking about where some of those opportunities lay, and where some of the challenges would be. And this is what we've amassed from all of those conversations. The first one is to really understand what parts of your organization, your suppliers, may no longer be sustainable. We know that there are going to be impacts on small businesses. We know that some of the local businesses, some of the tour operators, some of the hotel partners you have, some of the experiences that you have simply will not be able to sustain this. We need to make sure that we know which of our tourism products is really going to be there for us, which are operating on higher levels of margins, which may have cash in the bank to help support and supply your tourism industry going forward. We also know that many of our destinations have become increasingly reliant on a variety of different air carriers, which is good, but they're charter carriers, they're low-cost carriers, as well as even some scheduled airlines right now that are teetering on the brink. We've already seen one bankruptcy in Europe with Flybe, another one very close with Norwegian Airlines. Which of those airlines will still return? And as Damien pointed out, which ones will return to your destination? Because we believe that even those scheduled airlines and even those national airlines will return first to those destinations that actually have a plan, that actually have a strategy, a blueprint for reflection for those carriers to determine how they are going to return to profitability very quickly, because they're also at major risk at this time. How many of your, again, stakeholders can survive with and without stimulus? What kind of stimulus packages? It depends on a country by country basis. So which of your operations is really most at risk, and which are the ones that you can rely on? We also know that operators and channels may not return. Many of us who have had reliance on packages with airlines, low-cost carriers and charters, some of the low-cost operators operating at very, very thin margins may not return as well. And again, which of those tourism market segments, again, if we're reliant on a high volume, low yield segment, for instance, will some of those groups return, or should we recast our focus and reprofile our market investments into higher yield potential travelers out there? Damien, please advance the slide. Yeah. So I talked about segmentation for starters. Again, identifying who are those priority travelers. Who would be the very first travelers that we can return to our destinations? And we know that in many instances, and Tom talked a bit about this, that recovery will start likely from the regional and or domestic market. So we'll know that we can start to create some sense of vibrancy in our communities, which is very important for social media to communicate out there that our destinations are back. We have crowds, we have social media, we have user-generated content to demonstrate vibrancy within our communities. And those will be very, very important for starters. But when we start to dip our toe into more beyond the domestic market, into the international market, who are going to be those priority travelers? And research will tell us that some that are more resilient to travel may be the first ones that came back. 2 weeks ago, there was an Abacus survey here in North America that identified that, and this is 2 weeks ago, which is a lifetime in North America relative to what's been going on since then. But 48% of North American respondents said that regardless of what was happening, they were going to travel anyway. They were planning their trips. Now, of course, since then, borders have closed and flights have stopped, and they've been unable to actually fulfill their wishes to travel. But are these 48% of those North American traveling populations, are they going to be the first ones to return? What is their profile? Where do they live? How can we reach them? Because every destination will be seeking as fast a return for the international market as they can possibly find. There are also going to be segments of travelers that are no longer viable. There'll be huge economic impacts on many, many travelers out there. There'll be lots who have lost their jobs, who are looking first and foremost to recover their finances and income. There's been a significant hit to pensioners, to those that are over the age of 65 who have relied on their pension incomes that will be challenged over the next couple of years. So again, market research will help us identify which of those source market target audiences that we can rely on to rebuild our businesses first. Who are the most resilient of our respective markets? What are their profiles, and how can we encourage and engage them to help us rebuild our destinations the fastest? Next. The re-strategize identify is to identify which source markets, and how those source markets will be determined by whether they have viable air carriers and whether they have viable tour operators. We know that some source markets, for instance, Germany is highly reliant on travel trade, tour operators and travel agents to help them find their destinations in the future. What work are we, which of those operators will be viable and which will not be viable? It's very interesting to note that Thomas Cook went bankrupt last year in a year in which tourism had never been greater. We had the greatest number of tourists in 2019, and a huge tour operator like Thomas Cook goes bankrupt then. What hope is there for some other operators out there that may be operating at very, very similar thin margins as Thomas Cook? So let's be aware that some of the impacts that we're feeling in our destinations, that our small and medium-sized businesses are feeling, will also be felt by, again, air carriers and giant tour operators. And we have to identify which ones are most viable for our destinations and which may not be. We then need to prioritize operator channels. Really depends on which customer we're going after, which segments that we think are the most viable, and what are their common operator channels. And again, I think market research would help us determine their preferred channels so that we can reach them as quick as we can in order to recover our markets as quickly as we can. Prioritize airline partners. We know that some low-cost carriers, we know that some charter operations will be very slow to return. What are those scheduled airlines, and how can we engage them and encourage them to come back to our destinations? Your 5 flights a week from London may no longer be 5 flights. They may be 3 flights a week, but let's hold on to those 3 flights a week that we can get, move them up to 5 by demonstrating that we as a destination, your destination has a plan, you have a strategy, you're working with them as key partners in the development of that strategy. You're working with those key tour operators in that strategy, and you're demonstrating that you will be that viable route that will help them retain and grow their margins as they return to their own business as well. And again, what are the tourism products and experiences? Which are the icons that will remain within your destinations themselves? Which experiences will support the recovery first and fastest? What are the reasons why people want to choose your destination? How can we put those ideas out front and center? Certainly now through user-generated content, as Damien pointed out, how can we make sure that your destination brand is top of mind while not selling, but reminding everybody when they're dreaming, when they're fretting right now and worried, while they're dreaming of travel, they're dreaming of travel to your destination itself. Really, really important. Next one. And digital always, again, if there's anything that this crisis has created over the last couple of weeks, is it's turned everybody into a digital strategist. We are all digital first. We're now meeting over digital. We are learning and understanding. We're watching our Netflix shows over digital. We're watching our Facebook feeds over digital. And we're getting almost all of our news either from news sites that are digital or social media that's digital. We are very, very, very quickly learning to become digital. And that is exactly where people will turn when they're starting to dream of what they can do when they're no longer confined to their homes, where they have an opportunity to get out, grab a meal in a restaurant, grab a drink in a pub, or perhaps, again, dream of travel to those first destinations out there. We've created, again, this isolation period of new demographic digital natives. They used to be those millennials, and now they're people of all ages who are taking to their to the internet to help them with their entertainment as well as information going forward. Again, it's always been the most effective channel for tourism, and has been in the last 20 years. It's become the most cost-effective channel. Again, if there's one small prediction that we can make out of this whole crisis. Trust, again, traveler confidence has been eroded and needs to be won back. Tourism has already had a public relations problem. We were responsible for carbon emissions, the Greta Thunberg effect, flight shaming, overcrowding of degradation of communities, overcrowding of tourism sites, Airbnb, and now tourism has become the carrier of disease. And effectively, tourism needs a better PR agent. We need collectively, everybody on this call, to work together so that we can continue to take all of the great things that happen out of a trip, all the great things that can happen out of tourism, and communicate that effectively to the rest of the world so we can get them to travel once again. And I think that's going to be one of our collective efforts going forward. A couple more slides. First and foremost, we believe that the volume model will be slow to recover. We've become, again, as a collective destination with unprecedented, second fastest growing industry in the planet, we've become very accustomed to a volume model. We've all chased the numbers. We have to admit and look backwards to see, the declines that we're experiencing, we will be experiencing in the coming months and up to the year, are really based mostly on this volume model. It's been low cost, high volume travelers, and they will be the slowest to recover. Again, focusing more on getting back to the basics of our own destinations, looking at what drew travelers to our great destinations in the first place. Those higher yield, high value travelers may be the first to come back. The ones that are most resilient, the least risk averse, will be the first ones to recover. But the volume market may be a challenge. It may be a challenge for your destinations that have become increasingly reliant on it, and maybe a challenge for some of your operators in your markets. So the business at risk, again, mass tourism operators, again, may be those that will be left. And I hope there are many, many, many that are left, because we still require them in our business, but we need to effectively look and say, those ones might be at risk at first. So focusing on some of the higher yield operators first, and maybe the mass tourism operators second. Cruises, again, if tourism's taken a big reputational hit in the last couple of years, cruise has certainly been at the forefront of that hit. And cruises might take a little bit longer to return. And I know many of our destinations have really relied on the cruise industry to bring volumes of travelers, day trippers, etc., into our destinations. We've become rather addicted to the cruise industry itself. And we may have to tone that down a little bit as cruise itself is licking its wounds and trying to regroup, rebrand, and reprofile the business that they're in themselves. I mentioned already charter aviation and other low-cost carriers. Again, they will be themselves looking to see where, if they return to business, where they can find the highest yield destinations. The many small operators, the painful, terrible stories about people who've invested their life savings into their small business operations based on the destinations that we've created, based on the models that we've created, may be at the greatest level of risk. And again, these are important for us to try to support to the extent that we can today, because we will need them when tourism recovers. And basically, tourism absolutely will recover. And the final one is that rate itself will no longer drive occupancy. Occupancy will be driven by many ideas other than just simply rate. But packages will be important, enticing, compelling, and interesting packages to come to see your destination as a trip of a lifetime will return. So in terms of triage, the first and foremost is really focusing on retaining brand or destination awareness over business. As Damien said, we need to continue to keep top of mind in social media feeds. We need to continue to tell the great story, the story that Damien's focused on in Kenya itself, around reminding everybody that safaris are a wonderful natural experience. We all have those wonderful natural, cultural, and natural experiences that are in our destinations. Continue to tell those stories. People are focused on devices and looking for content that reminds them of the way life used to be. High yield, high-end cultural.
Hello, Greg. You're breaking up. Greg, I think your sound is having issues.
I think we just lost Greg there. I'm assuming everybody can still hear me. Let me just check someone in the audience.
Yes, David, I can hear you.
Okay, no worries. I'll continue. So basically, I think Greg broke up during those points, but essentially what he was talking about is considering those important first phase of travelers that will come back. Don't expect that we're going to immediately resume full-scale, large-scale group travel, package tourism, and cruise passengers. We need to realistically look at those small, fully independent travel products. A hiking trail is going to see more traffic initially than a cruise ship. Think about what's likely to start to rebuild volume and start to literally rebuild our industry from that startup position. And think about the fact that people are now going to view travel through the prism of what they've been through during this period. And the pandemic has brought up some new health-related issues in travel. People will be thinking about things like buffets, cruise ships where we've traditionally seen outbreaks of disease in the past, even Airbnb, and when it comes to health and safety regulations and hygiene, a lot of things are going to be reassessed through the prism of what we've been through. So as we move forward, we need to start.
Sorry, Greg is back, I think.
No, he's not. I'll just continue. I don't see him in my feed. Greg, are you there? No? Okay, I'll continue. So we need to start looking at, as I said, are you out there, Greg?
Yeah,
shall I just continue?
Please do. I'm sorry, but I've lost complete internet for a few minutes there, and I apologize to everybody. But please continue, Damien, just in case I lose it again.
No worries, and you can come back in for the questions. So we need to look at what the indicators of recovery will be as we start to move from this rethinking phase and having a strategy that's ready to shift us in recovery. Where will be the points of phase shift where we move into recovery? That's the question in everybody's mind. So we can see several indicators of when those phases will shift. Ease of travel restrictions is obviously the first one, when it's people are physically able at a very basic level to leave their houses and then move domestically between towns and then heading towards moving to other countries. So lifting of restrictions is obviously the first sign we see that recovery is coming and we start to activate these strategies. Resumption of domestic travel, focus on that domestic market, eventually moving out towards regional as well. As DMOs, you're going to have to think carefully about what that domestic strategy looks like. If you're somewhere with a lot of regions, if you start funding tourism campaigns within your own country, are you going to end up in a position where you're funding one region or one province against each other? That can be a challenge for some DMOs. So think carefully about that first phase of domestic travel and then out to regional. Resumption of flights is what will start to open up our destinations. We need to look, as we've said, at which airlines are going to come back. Don't assume every single scheduled carrier, charter, low-cost carrier is going to be back. They're not. They're going to come back in phases. What are those critical ones that will get to you? And particularly for regional travel, what are the hubs that you depend on? If there are connecting hubs to access your destinations, when are they going to open? You need a strategic plan for air access. And then the resumption of independent travel. But as we said, it's not going to be your cruise passengers. It's not going to be your package tour clients. It's going to be those independent travelers. We've seen them becoming a force to be reckoned with in the market, and they're now more important than ever. Those independent decision makers that will decide when they're going to travel again, and they're going to be the ones consuming those FIT-based products. So you need to develop a timeline in your organization. When you see easing of restrictions, what do we need to do to move us towards the point of domestic travel, towards the resumption of flights and opening up of regional and then international travel? How will we target those fully independent travelers? And then there's probably going to be a big gap before we see the return of group and volume travel. Any destination that's thinking they're going to get straight up to that point straight away is really going to struggle to implement a strategy. So a timeline, phase shifted model to shift you towards recovery. So your to-do list in this recovery phase, as you move into a recovery phase, streamline that team, retain engagement in the market to look at those future travelers. Make sure you can justify your role and budget. Another question for DMOs is, if we do see this last longer than expected, think about your role as a DMO. If we arrive at a point where it's the end of your financial year and your budget cycle and people still can't travel, is your treasury going to refund you? When they ask you what you do, your role cannot be just buying advertising and carrying out advertising campaigns. You need to show the importance of tourism to the economy and your role in getting it back on its feet as we look into new budget cycles. As Greg said, re-strategize and re-segment those markets and have plans to re-engage with airlines, operators, and partners, and agree what those indicators for your phase shifts are and what strategies you have in play for each point of shift. So what's this recovery going to look like, and what do you need to do as we move towards it? Greg, myself, anyone working with DMOs in the last couple of years have talked a lot about that middle M. What does it stand for? Are we destination marketing organizations or destination management organizations? Different countries are defining themselves in different ways. As we move into this recovery phase, that middle M sitting in the management point will now become critical. We're becoming even more management organizations. We need to focus in two areas: at a management level, at that re-engagement with the trade, providing support to our trade, looking at what economic stimulus is needed from government and doing a lot of lobbying work to achieve that, and a lot of negotiations with airlines, with tour operators, and with channels. On the marketing front, it's about a strategy to re-enter into markets, that strategy, that spend, and where you're going to focus. So having two core functions in your organization, for management and for marketing. You're going to need financial resources to do this. This is the concern around the world as we start to see our industry collapse, what we can do to get them back on their feet. You need to be an effective organization to do that. And that means you need a solid budget and a clever budget you spend in a smart way as well. It's absolutely critical that you invest into strategy, and not a strategy as you've had before, not just an advertising strategy, marketing strategy, but a recovery-based strategy. We are recommending that you find one campaign you're planning to do in the next year, a sales or conversion-driven campaign that is no longer possible or relevant. It might be an airline co-op with an airline that's no longer flying, which is most of them. It might be an OTA or sales-driven channel that's now not going to deliver you any traffic during this period. Take that money you're going to spend and convert it into a recovery strategy, investing in the help and resources you need to be able to implement a strategic plan to get yourself back to recovery, because you probably don't have the resources in your organization to deal with this. Nobody did, and nobody was prepared for this. This isn't just about advertising or even PR, and most crisis responses are driven by our PR departments. This is about a complete re-strategization, restructuring of your approach as an organization. Look for economic stimulus and support. That's important. Lobbying to those treasuries is critical. And have an economic recovery plan as well. The real risk we will see as tourism comes back is yield management. We do not all want to re-enter the market with bargain basement, drive us in a race to the bottom end of the market. We do not want to see we don't want to see a race to the bottom at a price level that ends up damaging our destinations and putting us back in a position that we're going to struggle to get back from when it comes to financial yield from tourism. So looking at positives as we move into recovery, I do think this is a period where we as organizations need to look at ourselves as startups, and that means reassessing tourism as a whole in our destination. Think about those conversations you've had as a DMO with your trade, with your partners, where you've said, you know, if only things were different. If only we didn't rely on this market, if only we didn't have these restrictions, if only we didn't have this problem in our destination. Well, all those things have gone. We're now at a level playing field. You're starting afresh. So let's do that in a smart way. We're in a new age of if only. We're in a new age of recreating tourism the way that we want it and the way that will work for our destinations. Consider those markets that were not performing or bringing you low financial yield. Maybe you don't want them back in the way they were. This is a period of renegotiation and rebuilding. Think about products that required and were not receiving volume, those areas that weren't receiving visitation. Can we move them to the fore of our marketing to make sure we more evenly distribute our tourism revenue and numbers? And if there's one thing we can say, we certainly solved that over-tourism problem. Everyone's talked about over-tourism for the last year as one of the great threats to our reputation and things. Well, it's certainly gone now. But let's not bring it back. Let's not aim to over-tourist our destinations, but to establish carrying capacities and ways to ensure we protect our reputation moving forward to get the right tourists at the right financial. And that is a core role for you as DMOs. It's going to make you one of the most critical resources for your country now. As you seek funding and support, it's a message that you need to put out. We are resetting, we're rethinking, rebuilding our tourism sector. So a to-do list for your recovery, increase your focus on destination management, develop a complete recovery strategy and find experts to help you with that. Make sure you have a re-engagement strategy with those partners, those airlines and those tour operators. Build up that market confidence and be ready for a phase shifted approach to getting tourism back. And the essential ingredient of this is strategy. And that has to start today. Do not wait until we start to see a recovery to start thinking about your strategic approach to that recovery. Plan it now. It is beyond a PR crisis plan. It is about a complete re-strategization of entire destination. So the skills, resource, and expertise to be able to do that. As I said, redistribute and reinvest that advertising money in this direction. The destinations that will recover the fastest are the ones that are developing plans now for execution strategies as and when COVID is contained and tourism starts to return. So I urge all of you to consider this react, rethink, recover approach to developing a strategic plan for your destinations. So these are Greg and my contacts. If any of you have questions or follow up after this, we're happy to send you more resources and information about how you can develop a plan in this direction. I hope all of that information was useful. I'm going to hand back to Paul now so that we can head into questions. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you all stay healthy and start moving towards rebuilding our trade and tourism together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damien. Thank you, Greg. As always, a fantastic presentation from both of you. So now I'll hand this over to Sarah Matthews, the Group Head of Destination Marketing at APAC for TripAdvisor. Just before I hand it over to her, just want to remind everyone, we'll have a Q&A after this, so please submit your questions in the Q&A function at through Zoom. And with that, I'll hand this over to you now, Sarah. Sarah.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Just trying to share my screen. The joys of technology, as they say. This is my first ever webinar, so bear with me. I wanted to say thanks very much for joining. I've been bugging the speakers whilst they've been speaking to try and tighten on timing. It's really tough because this is such an important topic, and it needs time. In a normal situation, we would probably run this as a 2-day summit or conference where we can really delve into it. But you know, knowing that you're all working from home, stuck indoors, I'm really appreciative of your time. So I wanted to share a little bit of insights from what TripAdvisor has been seeing just in the last couple of months. The situation with COVID is so fluid that we'll be updating this really on a weekly basis to ensure that we're really listening to what travelers are saying and sharing that information with you. So this information today is really only based on sort of the last couple of weeks of what we've been seeing. Now it will change again, probably by tomorrow. So the idea is to really keep an eye on insights from yourself and from partners like TripAdvisor. The 3 core trends that we've seen recently there has been a shift to domestic travel. Obviously, the caveat there is that, you know, in destinations where there is now, you know, a ban on even domestic travel, that's going to impact. We will start to see some of that change. We are also seeing some green shoots from China where there are early signs of recovery. And we're seeing that travelers are still coming to TripAdvisor really to get clarity and information as to when and the information relevant for their travel experience. So what we looked at was looking at some of the questions in terms of what travelers are asking about in our forums. And not surprisingly, it's lack of information. We've got 2 here from forum posts, one from a traveler who's visiting Thailand, one who's visiting Manila. And the question they're asking is, they're asking other travelers is, you know, what are the guidelines there? How do I get there? Are there any, you know, is there any information related to travel ban for foreigners? And so from a destination point of view, I know that a lot of you, both from a country level, but also from a state or city level, you might have very specific regulations. So it's absolutely critical to share that with the traveler so that they can plan effectively and really manage their travel experience. What we do see though, is that, you know, travelers are intentionally coming to TripAdvisor. So the way we define intentional traffic is the user's literally gone straight into TripAdvisor. So they've typed in TripAdvisor on the search or on they've opened up the mobile app. And what they're looking at is really in that forum space, looking at information, trying to find out, you know, if I want to fly to Kenya right now, is it possible? And if the destination doesn't have updated travel restrictions, then that makes it very hard for the traveler to understand their opportunities. When we look at travel, we really wanted to look at further insight into what are people saying about COVID in our forums. And it's really interesting when we look at the conversations across the 3 regions. Not surprisingly, for us in Asia Pacific, you know, we really started to see the spike late January. And you can see in our forums, based on these destinations like Japan, Thailand, Malaysia, we can really see travelers are spending a lot of time asking and discussing topics related to COVID-19. Towards the latter part of February and early March, it started to die down a little bit. But then on March 18th, we started to see more border closures. And again, the conversation picked up on COVID. The good news is that there are questions still being asked in the forums. There are travelers who are saying, well, you know, I was planning or I am planning to go to Japan. What opportunities are there for me? You know, am I able to go? Are there less public places for me to go? There's also people who are planning during lockdowns. You know, they're now, as Damien said, they're online. There's not a lot we can do, you know, every day at home. So this is the opportunity to let them escape and plan that trip. If I'm thinking about going to Australia and I've wanted to do however many states, this is the opportunity for me to plan. Or if I'm planning a food trip to Japan, this is the opportunity to share that information to help that traveler decide when they want to go and help them plan that trip. When we look at EMEA, you know, again, you can see the forum trends here. Late January, not a huge amount of conversation going on, but by late February, really starting to see, because this is really when February, in Italy, the outbreak started to be reported in Italy. As we've gone along towards just even last week, the conversations are still going on across Europe. But the good news is people are postponing, they're not cancelling, they're just trying to understand when I should go. And people are looking at, well, if I don't go now, I'll reschedule and go in October. But what we've also noticed is that people are saying that they'll, you know, where they had planned to go originally, they are still planning to go to that destination. It's critical that destinations keep those travelers engaged during this time. In the US, very similar trends to EMEA, a lot less conversation in January, really died down in February, but just last week, particularly the border closures in the US and Mexico, massive spike in terms of forum questions related to COVID. But in the US, they're saying the same thing. You know, they're thinking about going to New York. Their plan is to wait until early May. Some people are thinking, what can I do in LA when I go there in autumn? So these are all of the types of trends that we're seeing, and TripAdvisor is really keeping an eye on this on a weekly and daily basis. And that helps us to understand what opportunities are there and also how to talk to your traveler. So the key thing today, sort of for me to kind of pull it all back together, is really what's next. Many of you who know us and know, you know, worked with TripAdvisor know that we're all about action. I think it's absolutely critical that destinations really react, rethink, and recover. What we would recommend from TripAdvisor's point of view is to monitor the forums. There are travelers talking and asking about questions related to your destination. It's an opportunity for you to understand what those travelers are asking about. Update your listings. We've actually been working with some destinations. We hope to work with all of you for you to share with us what listings are impacted. A good example is that in some destinations in Japan, the museums have changed their opening times and closing times. Let us know, because we'll update that. If there are businesses that have unfortunately closed, let us know that as well. Most importantly, reach out to us. I think you've all got a TripAdvisor contact, a TripAdvisor friend. Please reach out. You know, a web coffee, so to speak. But the reason why is that we want to know what you need, what is critical to you right now, and how we can help you. We do have a plan in place. We've got some action plans for destinations that is really based on react, rethink, and recover. And the plan is to work with you along this journey. One of the things we'll be launching very soon is a program called Love Your Local. The idea here is to really support your industry who's suffering. And we want to focus on the faces behind the places and get travelers to experience what that destination, what that restaurant, what that tour is like, without having to leave the comfort of their home for now, but the opportunity for them to join later. So I remind you all that we're all here for you, and to just reach out and talk to us and let us know what you need. And with that, I know we're tight on timing, but I'm going to hand over and do the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for that great presentation. And now we'll take some questions. We got questions both in the Q&A and in chat, so I'll just read off some of the questions here. For any of our attendees, if you have any questions, feel free to please send them in. Either one is fine. I'll take them from either section, whatever is easiest for you. There's one question that was asked by two people, so I'm going to go with that question first. It's have we ever had this kind of when was the last time the tourism and travel industry faced this kind of crisis? So I think this is a question asked by two different people. So if anybody wants to answer that, Mario.
Sure, I'm happy to pick it up, Paul. And I know Tom, actually, you want to add some comments. I'll let you follow up if you don't mind.
Okay.
I have been asked this question a few times before over the last couple of weeks, and the answer is actually no. A few years ago, a company called OAG actually did a study looking back at the last 30 years of aviation travel, and look at the different type of crisis the industry has actually seen, from fuel crisis, economic crisis, terrorism attacks, wars, and pandemics, and etc. I did an analysis of how long does it actually take on average for recovery, depending on the type of different crises. The answers were quite interesting, because there were certain trends, either 3 months, 6 months, a year. But essentially, there are only two instances in the history of aviation that actually we had a crisis that took over more than 12 months for recovery: 9/11 and the economic crisis in 2008. Most of the other crises will typically take between 3 to 6 months to recover. This situation is like we've never seen before. In our opinion, this will actually last for probably much longer than that. The consequences of this are actually quite difficult, because, as it was explained by our speakers before, countries will start removing restrictions and in sequences. It won't happen in one go. And therefore, some countries will start opening before others. Some destinations will open, and therefore will make the situation last much, much longer. So to answer back the question, no, we've never experienced anything like this. Tom, I'll pass it on to you. I know you've got some comments as well.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think we just emphasise one point really. You know, we've seen global economic crises in the past, in the very recent past, and we've seen health-driven interruptions to travel and travel and tourism. But this is unique because it's a multiplier of the two. People are being prevented from traveling, and the prevention of traveling and the lockdown is going to have very significant economic impacts that people will feel on their financial situation. And so even when they're physically able to travel, like they were after SARS, they'll be feeling the financial impacts that they might have felt after the 2008-9 crisis. So the challenge for governments is really to make sure that the financial impacts that they feel are less severe than in 08-09, because otherwise, the travel industry will be facing a scenario that's a multiple of previous shocks.
Can I just jump in here as well? I think one thing that's really important as well is, whilst it's really impacting travel, it's impacting every sector. And it's something that, I was talking to someone recently, and unless you were sort of, a 10-year-old in 1918, I don't think any of us have experienced this. So it makes it harder to sort of predict what recovery or the future will look like.
Right. Thank you, Sarah.
Sorry, Mario, can I just add one final point? I've just been looking at some of our latest forecasts, and I think we're actually predicting it will take until 2023 for the global tourism market to get back to where it was in 2019. So to adjust to both the restrictions on movement, but then also for households to have recovered the financial losses and the appetite and the ability to spend and travel, we think that's a 3-year process from 21 to 23.
Thank you very much. There's another question here. I think two people seem to ask it. It's about funding or financial aid or stimulus packages. What kind of stimulus packages can help to recover the industry? And what's the best way for stakeholders to have productive engagement in times such as this? Anybody have any answers to that question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Damien.
Sorry, it's Greg here. Sorry. Yeah, I've had a couple of experiences. I managed through 2 crises when I was with Destination Canada, and we both spent a lot of time developing solid business cases in order for the government to invest in stimulus funding. We did so after SARS in 2003, and we did so after 2009 financial crisis. And we were able to get upwards of over $20 million to support incremental funding to help us bring back the industry at that particular time. I think that it's really important for and during this crisis that tourism needs to raise its hand and put together solid business cases that support the true impact that it's having on our industry itself, and with a solid rationale in terms of how we're going to recover that market. And as I think Damien pointed out, we need some good, solid strategic data, some research-based data, help us communicate with our government authorities that we need stimulus money to do that. This is not one of those things you can just put together a nice glossy ad and sell your destination and hope that brings everybody back. That may be part of it, because we're going to need to rally the troops. We're going to need to rally our industries with those types of visuals, but they need to be steeped in some strategy. And again, looking forward to develop your new strategy going forward would be the most effective way to demonstrate to your shareholders and government that you require additional stimulus. Every industry is going to be seeking stimulus packages. Tourism needs to be more cohesive in their request and have a solid business case to support that.
And also, I would add to that is think about how you're going to lobby government in terms of demonstrating the economic linkages of tourism. It's something we've always talked about in the past. How many jobs depend on tourism? How many sectors are supported by tourism? Agriculture, food, marketing, insurance, everything comes back to tourism in many ways. And think about how you're going to present that case study to your government for recovery. Carnival Cruises should not be the poster child for tourism recovery, or a major hotel chain. It needs to be those small businesses, those employees, those people who are going to suffer and hit the most. If we want to justify bringing back tourism, we need to show the value to our economy and the value to our people, and move it beyond just that macro corporate level in terms of its linkages and impact.
Just, I'd like to make. I mean, I can make one related point on that, Damien. We at Oxford Economics and Tourism Economics work very closely with the World Trade and Tourism Council to produce very regular reports for each of the countries and around the world that demonstrates exactly that economic contribution that the sector makes. So the sector at the global level supports about 270 million jobs. And obviously dissecting that into the country or the region where our attendees are based today will be very useful. So if anyone would like to be pointed in the direction of the work that we do in that respect, then please do get in touch with us at Oxford Economics.
Thank you very much, Tom. So I think this actual question is for you, Tom. What facts and knowledge are the assumptions for the near future based on, besides GFC and SAS takeaways, which are both quite different from this crisis?
We are all obviously working in a very uncertain environment. So uncertainty relates to the spread of the outbreak and the response of governments to that outbreak. If we were having this discussion a month ago, then we would have been having a different baseline, and the position we're now in would have been our downside scenario. We're clearly in that scenario now, and there's a degree of uncertainty about whether or not things will stabilise in Q2 or whether things will worsen yet further. And so we're having to make a judgment based on the available information we have, and our baseline forecasts are based on an assumption that the stabilisation takes place in the quarter ahead, and then those restrictions ease. But we're operating under the same uncertainty as everyone else. When it comes to translating that into a tourism forecast, we do a lot of modelling internally that relates the market for each country's inbound to the spending power of the tourists that visit there. So for a country like Thailand, obviously China's economic performance is very key, because Chinese workers and households will depend on their earnings at Chinese factories and offices in order to be able to visit Thailand. And that's a modelling approach that we do using our global economic model and bespoke tourism models that have a wealth of data to make those connections. We're obviously happy to talk to any attendees about how they can access those data. But what I would say is that at the moment we are all working around scenarios rather than necessarily talking about particular point forecasts.
Thank you very much, Tom. There's another question here. It's going to go on the list here. So what should be the strategy to bring back your destination to a tourist bucket list? Should it be a long-term strategy or short-term? If any of Greg, Damien, or Sarah or Mario want to respond to that?
Sorry, you actually broke up a little there. Could you repeat the question?
What should be the strategy to bring back your destination to tourist bucket list? Should it be a long-term strategy or short-term?
I think it definitely has to be an immediate-term strategy, because as I said during the presentation, you have a literal captive audience of people who cannot leave their homes right now. And one of the things they're inevitably going to be dreaming about doing at the first sign of recovery is travel. So that term bucket list has become critical as a kind of next year list. That's what they're thinking about. And I think the more platforms that can show them a variety of destinations, that can show them content from destinations, you look at platforms like Sarah's on TripAdvisor, others that have travel specific content are going to become critical in this. But also, as I said, think about those experiences you have that you can be sharing now, but do it in an appropriate way. Obviously, you cannot show human interactions. You shouldn't be out trying to show a community tourism project where people are interacting with local people. It's physically impossible at the moment. But think about your views, your natural resources, wildlife, temples, shrines, museums, art galleries, and also things that maybe this is a good time to show them without the crowds. It's a phenomenon we're seeing here in national parks, for people to see what these ecosystems look like with no people in them. Same goes for many tourism sites in the world. So it really is about an immediate term strategy now in terms of planning to get that content out there. But what's critical is, when do you start moving it from bucket list to actual travel? And I think getting people to engage with you, getting them to register with you, to get in touch with you, to ask questions and give you details so that you can start building up a database for marketing in that recovery period is really important as well. Anyone else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to add, it's not just only good for the traveler, but also think about it from your industry. You've got industry partners who are really suffering. You know, there's no business for them, but this is an opportunity perhaps from the government side to support these businesses by actually getting them to go out and create content for you. I'm thinking about some of the wonderful hikes that we have in Hong Kong, where you can do a full day hike where you're completely on your own. And that's a great experience to have. Or some of our fabulous little restaurants in Hong Kong where, you know, a local chef could be showing how do you make a proper sweet and sour pork, or, you know, a really tasty bowl of wonton noodles. This is the opportunity to help the industry. So I think there's two parts to that. And the reason why they go so well is that they can come together.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'll move on to the next question here, trying to get through all of them. I know we're a little over time here. So the next one is about domestic tourism. As we know, domestic tourism is the first segment to recover. But I guess, you know, over the past few weeks, we've seen the crisis have a real effect on domestic tourism, particularly something like Thailand, where they've sort of put checkpoints now between the different provinces. So what kind of stimulus package or what kind of stimulus can you do for domestic travel when COVID starts to disappear?
Yeah, maybe it's Greg here. I'll take a shot at that one. I'm a huge fan of domestic travel during times of crisis. I mean, first and foremost, they are, you know, your lowest hanging fruit of opportunity. Most destinations that have a large, wealthy domestic population will rely on them anyway for their tourism. We need to fill attractions, hotels, restaurants, and experiences as quickly as we possibly can, so that those places themselves can be viable and start to welcome the more lucrative international travelers. We also need to create a sense of vibrancy in a destination and sort of to recreate the vibe of the particular place itself. And those two things are done at early stages through domestic travel, so that we can then quickly move on to, again, as I said, the more lucrative international markets. There have been many tools that we've used, but yes, I've seen instances of incremental stimulus funding from government to communicate to your domestic market, or in even some cases to subsidize some of the travel, where they have discounted hotel rates or discounted attraction rates that are being subsidized by the governments themselves in order to encourage that travel. But in many instances, it's more of a return to pride. It's an idea that says, you know, travel, see your own country first. It help us rebuild our tourism industry, help us rebuild our country. And those domestic campaigns can be very effective to do that.
Thanks, Greg. We got more questions here. I'm gonna give this question to Damien. So destinations who are dependent on China, in your view, how important is it to include them while we retarget? Did you get that question, Damien?
I did, yes. I think if anything, this one of the learnings from this experience is going to come through is that being reliant on one destination is a mistake. Single sourcing your tourism has been a threat that's been identified by multiple people over recent years. We've heard again and again destinations being told you're developing a monocultural tourism product with the Chinese market, and now we've seen what they were talking about. What happens? And I had heard that line in multiple tourism discussions. What would happen if that was cut off? In fact, Mario, I know you actually wrote a blog, I'm not sure it was this year or late last year, saying what would happen if all the Chinese stopped traveling. We found out. So any monocultural tourism approach is a bad idea. But there's still going to be a market. There's still going to be a market that we'll deal with. That needs to be part of your strategy and strategic plan. But I'd also feed back to that if only slide that I referred to, because many people were finding issues with that market, particularly when it came to yield, when it came to volume models. This is a time to restructure and rebuild your Chinese market in a way that's going to work for China, but most importantly, work for you as well in terms of your revenues and your trade and a more equitable spread. Sarah, maybe any comments on the Chinese market?
Yeah, I would always agree that, you shouldn't be focusing on one market. It's something that we've been talking about, TripAdvisor with Parter, with Damien and Greg, and with Tourism Economics, that we need to move away from this, perpetual one number. I see consistently that governments are saying, I need bigger and greater arrival numbers. But what we need to look at is that how that impacts your communities and your tourism products. I always use a very simple example. If we break a landmark, it's very hard to fix. I mean, take Angkor Wat was built in the 4th century. It's very hard to replicate one, and it certainly won't have the same value to the traveler. So I think it's critical to think about how you talk to your audience. And it's really not about the country. It really should be focused on the type of traveler, getting them to do the right thing in your destination that really makes sense. And given we're tight on timing, I'm going to jump straight on to the next question, which was about, well, how do you tell great stories? Well, I think, Damien and I have both talked about, especially right now, the first thing is you should be telling great stories. You shouldn't be going dark. Making sure you're providing accurate information where it needs to go, but also giving that opportunity. I've always wanted to go to Kenya, for example, to do a safari, but it's hard for me to know where I want to go and how do I want to do it, because I've got I want to do it in a certain way. I want to do it like Elizabeth Taylor, for example. So the question for me right now, I'm sitting at home, this is the opportunity of Kenya Tourism, is they provide me with like a trip planner, or for me to experience a virtual safari. That gives me an opportunity to go, gosh, that's amazing. I really need to book that now. And you've got me. You've now captured that traveler. Even though they may not fly now, they will eventually come back to you. And every destination has those great stories. I think the issue is sometimes we get wrapped around by trying to do something beyond what is natural to us, and that's not necessary. So I think it's really about understanding your own destination, what's the DNA, and then sharing that with the traveler. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think we've gone way over time here. So I'd just like to thank all of our speakers for presenting us. Thank all the attendees. I think Dr. Mario Hardy would like to wrap up with a few closing words. Mario?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Paul. First of all, I'd like to actually thank Sarah and Tom, Greg, and Damien for having spent the time today. I know especially for Greg, who is actually in the middle of the night at the moment. Thank you very much for joining all of us. I'd like to conclude with a few things that I've actually already mentioned for those of you who've been reading Pata's blog and other stories, is the importance of making sure you rely on reliable sources of information, as Damien mentioned during his presentation. We are inundated by infodemic, by information left and right from our social media, from traditional medias, and etc. on a daily basis. And there are a few providers out there who actually are providing good information. World Health Organization, some of your trade organizations such as PATA, of course, IATA, ICAO, UNWTO, and many others. We started at PATA a few weeks ago already to aggregate some of these factual based and data set information on a weekly basis, which we add to our newsletter. We are in the process of building up an online resource center, as it was mentioned initially. This resource center will go live probably within a week's time or about, so follow us on our newsletter. And if you're not, sign up on our website, and we'll let you know as soon as it's opened. On the resource site, you will find not only the news that we publish on a weekly basis, but you also find some surveys and some other information we'll be adding as a tourism monitor, some data sets from some of our providers. And also we're in the process at the moment of collecting information from each of the respective destinations. Many of you on this call would have received a letter from myself earlier this week of asking information as to where can we find the information from your respective governments on the financial aid packages offered to businesses in your respective destination. This is a question we've been asked by many of our private sector members. It is actually not that easy to find this information in for some destination. So we believe having one location where we can find it will make it useful for everyone. We're already started to add some of the data. Many destinations have already responded. Those of you who have received a letter who haven't responded yet, we encourage you to do so over the coming days. Those who haven't, feel free to reach out to Paul or myself, and we're happy to add you to that list. And then please stay home, stay safe, and plan your trip for the future. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll give it back to Paul.
Thank you very much, Mario. So just wanted to share this. So if you wanted a copy of the presentations, please do email me. My name is Paul Brunkan. I'm the Director of Communications and External Affairs. My email address is here, paul@pata.org. If you want a copy of the video of the webinar, please do email me as well. We will not be making these things public, so you need to contact me directly. Again, thank you to Damien, to Greg, to Tom, and especially to Sarah for helping us organize this wonderful webinar today. A lot of great feedback, and I hope you guys do join us for future webinars and follow us on our Facebook and social media channels to keep updated with PATA. Thank you very much and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.